everybody. It's Stephanie Baker again, Executive Director and Clinical Pastoral Counselor on staff for Life in Abundance. We are a nonprofit here in the upstate that offers counseling to families. We believe that by strengthening families, we strengthen our communities. And so we've been doing the On the Couch series now for a while. There are three focuses that we have, three objectives that we have for this podcast. And I just kind of want to take a moment and remind everybody of what those are. The first is that we want to talk about relevant counseling topics, much like the one we're going to be talking about today. And we want to take away some of the mystique and the negative connotations that go with counseling. So if you are considering seeking a counselor or a family member may need to do that, hopefully some of the things that we're talking about are relevant for you and might help make that decision a little bit easier. I will be talking with various counselors in the area, not just those on my team, but others. We have a wonderful referral network for when we are not the answer for everybody. And so I'm very proud of that. We've worked hard for that. And today we're going to be talking to somebody who is in that referral network, who's been a guest on our podcast previously a couple of times. He always brings great information, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. The other two areas that we focus on would be functional nutrition and functional medicine and topics that are relevant there. We believe that we are body, soul, and spirit beings. So we are whole people. And so there are times when there are physical things that can cause emotional things in us. And so we want to highlight topics in functional medicine and nutrition that might be relevant, that may help people feel better. And it might be things that you've not heard of before. And so we bring on a number of different professionals that provide services in those areas. We've had, for example, Dr. Ray Benedetto, on multiple times to talk about autoimmune disease and to talk about testing and what tests help determine, which autoimmune disease. And so we're going to continue to highlight those topics and bring those types of things for you as well. The other thing that we do is talk to people who are in other ministries in this area. And we do that. We want to highlight other ministries because it may be that they have resources that would be helpful to you. And if you don't know about them, then you're not going to know about their resources either. And so those are the three reasons, the three focuses of the On the Couch podcast. Now, one disclaimer before we get started. I am a clinical pastoral counselor on staff, as well as the executive director for Life in Abundance. But I need to let you know that my licensure, I'm not licensed by the state of South Carolina. So that's the disclaimer that I have to give at the beginning of every one of our podcasts. The guest that we have today, we're going to move on into that, is returning, as I mentioned earlier. He's John Nolette with Restoring Hope Counseling, and they are located in Anderson. Their website is restoredhope.com, and you can see their team. You can see John there and his credentials. He's just a wealth of knowledge, and we love having him on here every time we get the opportunity. He's always bringing things in that are new and things that we need to be considering regarding the topics we're discussing. But John focuses on his work with children's and teens with neurodevelopmental disorders and families, helping them with parenting strategies when they find themselves in that situation. John has a master's in professional counseling from Liberty University. And as I said, he is a wealth of knowledge. So John, welcome. We are glad to have you back. This is a fairly serious topic today that we're going to choose. And I guess I need to also give the disclaimer that if you have young ones around, you may want to have them exit, or you may want to listen to this as a recording, at a little bit later date. We are going to be talking today about the topic of suicide. And we're going to be talking about it as it is on the rise, and the thinking about it, the ideation that goes with it is on the rise in our youth. And so, John, we're bringing you back today because we want to really talk about that and what you're seeing in practice, what you're seeing now in young people. What are the trends? What are the things parents need to be paying attention to? And do we take every threat of that seriously? Are there times when it is a manipulative tool by a young person? Help us walk through this.
Yeah, thank you for having me back, Stephanie, and thank
Yeah.
you for your audience who joins us on these podcasts. It's good to be back and be able to talk about a very difficult topic today with suicide. So I think when you look at numbers, like again, more recent data is not really out there. The most recent stuff that's put out by like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration and the National Alliance for Mental Illness. It's kind of stuff from 2022, but I think when you look at their data, the impact of suicidal ideations or suicide itself, kind of across the United States, we see it as about 4.3% for adults. So that's about 10.6 million adults. And when you talk about children under the age of 18, we see about 18% that are impacted. Um, Again, so those being children from anywhere from 2, 3 years old all the way up until they're 18 years old. Um,
Wow.
and so I think the numbers are, even though we're a couple years behind here, being in 2025, the numbers are on the rise. And so some of the data that shows is, in 2022, you're talking about 49,000 people who took their lives through suicide methods. And it's the 11th leading cause of death in the United States for individuals.
Wow.
Those populations, you talk about people that are 75 years of age and older. They're the highest rate of people who take their own lives through suicide. And then you can see it's the second leading cause of death for the age groups of 10 to 14-year olds, and then 15 or 25 to 34-year olds.
I'm sorry. Can you just say that one more time,
Yeah.
please?
So it's the leading cause of death for those that are 75 and older. It's the second leading cause of death for those age groups 10 to 14 and 25 to 34 years of age.
John,
Yeah.
the weight of that statement, that's shocking to me. I did not realize those numbers. That is shocking to me. What is going on in our youth that is contributing
Well, I
to
think I
this?
think some of the contributing factors when you really think about when we talk about the world today and technology and how easily we talk about being connected, I think what we miss out a lot of times is there's not meaningful connection in that. So you have a lot of young people, children, adolescents who, I mean, and this isn't just even now, you're talking 20, 30 years ago, you had that turnkey generation that was oftentimes home alone, spent a lot of times by themselves, had two parents that were working outside the home, and so were with other caregivers or were required to be by themselves for many hours throughout the day. What you get is you get a lot of people who isolate and withdraw, and so they feel like they're connected, but there's not really an actual meaningful relationship and connection that's formed there when you're talking about their only way of connecting to the world outside is through technology devices, whether
No,
that's
no
video.
depth is
Yeah,
kind of what you're saying.
there's no depth to those relationships, um, and I think there's been an increase in violence. So I think when we talking about being when we talk about being like numb to violence, I think we see it in TV shows, we see it in video games,
Gaming,
we see it in
definitely.
the news. And so there's an aspect of people have become very numb to the violence that you see, and we've almost normalized it. And in some ways, it's taken as like, well, that's just a form of entertainment. But I think we got to remember, the Bible talks about what we take in, right? Like kind of leads to
Right.
our behaviors. Like we are what we take in oftentimes. And
Yes.
so it's in our hearts. And so I think you deal with people who are isolating and withdrawing. Um, we are meant to live in community and connection, and so you have people who are pulling away from that need that we have as human beings. And then you have people who are becoming numb to violence and that kind of thing through video games, through television shows, and just look at it as entertainment, and it doesn't really impact them, but it does in a way because that kind of sinks in for them and becomes something that becomes a thought pattern and a process for them of when they're in these really deep dark places, when we're in the basement to say of
Hmm.
depression, or we're in that pit of depression or loneliness, what do you do to get out? For a lot of people, they don't feel like there's a way out of that, and doing that alone, there's often not a way out of that. It drives us into behaviors we don't really want to continue.
So, in your practice, what are the average ages for you that, when we're talking under 18, what are the average ages that you're seeing with kids that are threatening this, or maybe their parents? And how did they get to you? Did they threaten it in their parents' presence or school's presence? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, in counseling practice, I've seen kids from 8 to 18 years old really have some. So one clarification would be the concept of suicidal ideation. So having thoughts of suicide. Um, there's passive and then there's active. So passive would be that we have thoughts of death or taking our lives, right? And then active would be with those thoughts, there's actually motivation and planning into actually, taking our own lives or creating a plan to, in some behavior to follow through with. And so I think there's a lot of kids between 10 and 18 in my practice that I've seen who have a lot of those passive suicidal ideations. And it doesn't take a lot of stress or, negative life circumstances or people who continue to kind of feed a very negative narrative for them and them taking that and running with that and that becoming more prevalent for them in terms of those dwelling on those thoughts of ending their life. Oftentimes with those kids, you see, oh, well, my parents would just be better off if I wasn't alive. Like it'd be easier if I just wasn't here. Um,
Right.
Life's too hard. I just don't want to keep living. Like, and these are all little statements that even kids will make
Hmm.
and start to dwell on and think about what would that actually look like, right? And so, and then when you're talking about the increase in the nature of entertainment and things that these kids have access to, it's easy to start researching and looking up information on what someone could do or how to go about that. Um, and so I think it becomes a little bit more prevalent when you're talking about individuals who are dealing with severe depression, big stressors or life changes that have been negative for them. You can see teens and young adults who are struggling with sexual orientation identities, who kind of get picked on or don't have good quality relationships in their lives, or people who are in their corner who think about these things. I think when we talk about like physical health, if you're dealing with chronic pain, for a lot of people, they just want the pain to end. So you'll hear statements of, I just want the pain to be gone.
Hmm.
Like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And so, they start thinking through what's a way to kind of exit or not deal with that anymore. And then I think, again, when we talk about negative thoughts, we all have automatic negative thoughts. We call them ants, right?
Yes.
So, and so these become things that without even really consciously thinking about these things start popping up in our minds. And so people ignore those or they're not even aware of those and they don't actually deal with those ants. And so it increases anxiety levels, it increases thoughts of depression if you've been through a traumatic experience or an abuse and neglect.
Hmm.
So when we talk about like adverse childhood experiences, you often see these individuals that this can be a sign or something that individuals have dealt with that lead to more suicidal ideations. And then I think what people don't often consider too is sometimes a lot of the medications that we put people on, especially some of our antidepressants. And again, I'm not a doctor,
Right.
so that would be something you always want to follow up with your medical provider. But sometimes some of those medications, the black warning label for some of those is increased suicidal thoughts and ideations.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
we're not even aware of what we're putting in or taking in our body and what kind of risk we're taking on with that, that could cause more of those negative thoughts and ways of dealing with things.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because there, and I don't want to get too political here. That's not the purpose of this broadcast or this podcast, but there is a link with those and school shootings, actually. And so I don't think, to your point, I don't think we can deny that. I don't think we can ignore it. It is a fact. And part of the reason that I'm so drawn to functional nutrition and functional medicine is because we're looking for root causes, not just wanting to treat symptoms. And so when someone comes to us and they are saying that they don't feel like themselves, I have had somebody sit in my office and say, I just don't feel like myself. This was after a session. It was at the end of a session where we had been talking about something completely different. And I asked her to clarify what she meant. And she said, physically, I just don't feel like myself. And she was crying. She goes, I know it's stupid. And I said, that's not stupid. That's you recognizing something is off in your body. And so I asked her some very pointed questions about her health. She gave me her answers, and we determined that it sounded a lot like her thyroid was not
Mm,
performing the way that it
mm,
needed to. I asked her additional questions, and what was uncovered is that she had had mono as a 15-year-old, a horrible case of mono. So
yep.
she was fighting Epstein-Barr most likely, right? At that
Yep.
moment, this could be possible. So some blood work within the next week told us that she also had Hashimoto's autoimmune disease, which definitely was her thyroid, and she
Yeah.
was in a reactivation of Epstein-Barr virus.
Yeah.
And so this is a step, it scares me actually as a provider, to think about things like that being a root cause of why somebody feels bad, but yet they may be put on some kind of antidepressant. And I'm not anti-medication. I believe there's a time and a place, but I also believe it's the first thing that we go to a lot of times, and it's overprescribed, and it's also not always prescribed by those who have studied, and unfortunately by those who have studied like specialists. Okay. And
Yep.
so what's happening is the client or their patient becomes an experimental situation, a lab experiment. And okay, well, let's try this. If this doesn't work, we're going to try this. And when you go to somebody who has studied the classifications of medications and studied mental health, and I'm speaking of of psychiatry, right?
Hmm.
It
Yep.
takes the experimentation from this to this. And again, there is a time and a place for that. But what if it's gut related? That somebody is, I mean, there is a gut brain axis, and I could go on for an hour about just that. I think, I think your point is very well taken with that. So here I am, we'll say I'm a parent, and
Hmm.
I've got a 12-year-old, just like one of my clients did, who every time he didn't get his way at home, he was a huge gamer, whenever they would restrict things like screen time, gaming time, I'm just going to kill myself. That was the phrase that was thrown around. And one of the things that was suggested is that they take him seriously, and when that threat happened, take him to the emergency room, and they did that. Talk to me about what parents, what are they supposed to do when their child or adolescent is throwing this around?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the hardest things because I think you always want to take a statement like that serious, like because
Yes.
you don't know where someone really is in that thought process of,
Right.
have they planned something out? Have they really thought about this in more details? And some people lie to us, right? And so you
Yes.
can be in the room with someone and having this conversation, and they know what you're trying to ask, and so
Yep.
they're going to lie to you about that. I think
Right.
with kids especially though, when you think about kind of negative attention seeking versus positive attention seeking, as parents, and I'm a parent of three kids myself between 9 and 13 years old, so we've entered that adolescent phase ourselves with middle school. Um, I think when you think about those types of issues and those types of conversations and statement, I think you as the parent have to be the expert on your child, right? And so what I mean by that is you have to know, are they doing this for some kind of attention?
Hmm.
Is this a passing thought, or is this something that they dwell on and actively think about, that this could be a real threat and danger and I need to follow up? Because here's the other thing. When you start, the boy who cried wolf, when you start going to the ED every time your kid makes a statement like that,
Right.
eventually you're going to stop getting the help that you need because it's going to be
Right.
marked in their system and in their
Right.
files that, oh, this kid's come 5 times in the last year, and this was nothing more than just some attention seeking behaviors.
Right.
And so I think, I say all that to say I think you as the parent need to be able to have an open line of communication and be able to really listen and actively pay attention to what other things are showing up in your child's life. Because again, I mean, I think when we think about like musicians and artists, like they express themselves through their words and through the means of their art, and I think kids express themselves through behaviors and words sometimes, and sometimes they're big words like, "Well, I just want to kill myself,"
Right.
and again, it can be something over simply like, "I lost the video game," or "I got a bad test grade," right? And so I think again, you always want to take statements like that serious, but what the follow-up needs to be, I think sometimes, I think we jump the gun and we immediately go to like worst case scenario instead
Mhm.
of really being able to be the expert on our own kids and getting them the help. Hey, you know what? I'm really concerned. I don't like you making those statements. I'm wondering what other kind of thoughts you have. So maybe we should go and work with a professional who could help us in that nature, right? And that's how you can start that conversation because they're probably going to be resistant to getting help. But oftentimes, what I see is those parents just want me to. Those are parents, unfortunately, sometimes who just want me to fix their child and the thought process without realizing how the environment plays a factor into
Right.
a lot of what's going on for those kids. There's relationship problems with peers, or there's issues at school, or there's parents who aren't really involved at home, or are just working a lot, or are distracted with other things. And again, not always parents' fault, but sometimes we
Right.
miss them.
Right.
And so I think in understanding that, it's really constantly building that relationship with your children where they know they can come talk to you, and you have that open line of communication to be honest. And in the same way, like, we've got to stop negatively reinforcing those behaviors we want to change, right? So, like, oh, well, this is because you play Call of Duty, or because you're playing Fortnite, so you're going to lose your video games. Well,
Hmm.
that's the only way your kid accesses a form of connection, or relaxes. You've just taken away the only thing he knows how to do to help him relax, calm down, and connect with other people.
Yeah, that's a very big point right there. That's a very
So
big.
again, finding other ways to discipline, finding other ways to correct that, and also understanding sometimes what the steps are to getting help rather than just going to the ED, the emergency.
So let's walk through that.
Yeah.
What are the steps to get the help if I'm the
So
parent?
So if a parent was in a counseling session with me and that was something I knew previously, or something that came up in a session, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do some safety planning. And so again, what that's going to be is it's not necessarily a formal assessment. Oftentimes it's just interviewing and questioning, um, very directly what some of those thoughts are. So again, have you thought about ending your life? Do you have a plan of how you would end your life? Um, how frequently do you think about these things? Again, because what you want to identify is, how serious is this risk? So
Right.
it's always a risk, but again, how do we mitigate and kind of lessen that risk for those individuals, whether it's a child, an adolescent, or an adult, right?
Right.
And so in safety planning, then we're also going to be looking at, from that, if it is an active suicidal ideation where they have thoughts of ending their life, but they also have thought through a plan and motivation,
Hmm.
and have access to carry out that plan, then that's where the next step is to get them immediate help. That might be calling an ambulance, 911, to get them to an emergency department. That might be calling a local community program. Like in Greenville, we have Carolina Center for Behavioral Health. They
Yes.
have a 24/7 hotline that you can call, and have an assessment over the phone with someone, and they will tell you, "Hey, we're going to get an ambulance out there to come see you. You need to get here as soon as possible, and we're going to get them admitted," because they have inpatient programs for adolescents, children, and adults. And then they also have outpatient programs, which is like a partial hospitalization program where you'd be there from like 9 to 4, um, like 4 or 5 days a week, and that's for
Hmm.
a set amount of time. And then they have intensive outpatient programs, which can be in person or virtual, but that's like 3 nights a week for a couple hours. You'd be meeting in kind of like group stuff, and you'd be working with a professional, as well as kind of other individuals who are dealing with similar.
One of the things I like about that is that I'm going to go back to something that you said. You said a lot of times parents want you to fix their kid. No counselor is there to fix any person. That's not why we exist. We exist to offer differing solutions. We exist to help people see perhaps a different perspective in whatever their situation might be, and help give them tools to work through things that they cannot change. But we're not there to fix anybody.
Yeah,
And we cannot work with somebody typically 4 or 5 days a week. Our schedules, there are other clients. And so, with the intensive outpatient programs and the inpatient programs, what I love is they're getting that help consistently multiple times, sometimes multiple times in that day. They're also hearing that they're not alone because they are with other people who have similar experiences. Now, everybody's unique, but sometimes that by itself makes a difference to people. And if I'm not mistaken, there is a psychiatrist on staff there as well. So they have group therapy, they have individual counseling, and they have a psychiatrist. It's basically a turnkey solution to
yeah.
that
Which
immediate need.
which while they are there, if they are in the inpatient program, they will be assessed for medication
Yep.
needs. They will be assessed for medications that they've previously been on.
Yes.
And so they are doing like thorough formal assessments, and they are meeting several times throughout the day, especially in their inpatient program,
Yeah.
where they are kind of working through and addressing some help. I think the other factor too that we often don't consider is substance use. And so,
Yes.
so not only do you have mental health conditions and disorders like
Hmm.
psychosis, depression,
Hmm.
anxiety, grief and loss, trauma, but I think sometimes we've got to consider the factor of substance use and risk-taking behaviors. And so, when those increase for individuals, oftentimes in a way they are putting themselves in situations where this becomes a much greater factor and risk for those individuals because of kind of where they find themselves and how desperate they are to get their next hit, to get their next fix. And I think numbers increase there in terms of even younger kids when you talk about vaping and marijuana.
Right.
You get kids younger and younger who are kind of getting into those things without realizing what they are putting in their bodies and how it's affecting their minds. And so again,
Yes.
I think unfortunately one of the downfalls of counseling is we often don't look at the brain functioning because we're not thoroughly trained in that to look at that. But we do miss some of those factors of what's going on, not only chemically, but what's going on neurologically for individuals. And so,
Yes.
like the antidepressants you were talking about earlier, those medications, not well researched on the
Right.
efficacy and long-term outcome for people who are on those medicines. There can be lots of side effects and risks with those medications. And I think when it comes right down to it, when you talk about chemical imbalance and that being helpful for people, research has shown about 33% of people who actually have depression or anxiety, it's because of a chemical imbalance, something that's going on in their body
Hmm.
because of biological or genetic factors. And so the impact for most people, that 66% of the population who takes those kind of medications, it's not super helpful because it's not addressing a chemical imbalance.
Right. That's staggering.
So,
That's staggering.
so there's other
Um,
factors that play into that,
yes.
like life decisions, stress, relationships, if there's a
Nutrition.
substance, nutrition,
Yeah.
sleep is a huge factor.
Yes.
When if you've ever met someone who doesn't sleep well, they
Right.
can often be very moody, and they often seem like they're not fully present and engaged in conversation.
Negative filter, so
Very
to speak.
negative filter in the way
Yeah.
they think about life and the outcome they have. And so I think again, especially with children and adolescents, you want to take it serious, but you also want to know that individual and know what they're trying to do. Um,
So then what happens if I talk to my child, my adolescent, and there's no plan? We're assuming they haven't lied to me. There's no plan. This is more of the passive, as you've talked about.
yeah,
What then?
I think again, you'd want to get someone who maybe they trust, an adult, if that's not a parent, because sometimes that's not a parent for your
Right,
child or
right,
your adolescent. And so find a trusted adult, a coach, a teacher, someone from church, someone in the community that can maybe kind of talk with them, but also seek help. At that point, that's the time to seek some professional counseling.
yeah,
Because at that point, what you're doing is you're proactively engaging in the process of getting them help. So these negative thoughts and feelings don't continue to get worse or spiral out of control.
right,
And they're actually able to start working on it. Because again, I think for all of us as humans, we have the skills of what we have, right?
right,
And so whether that's positive or negative, if it's helpful or unhelpful, we use the skills that we've been taught or think we have. And sometimes they don't help for people. And so I think some people with suicidal ideations, they think the only way that they can fix whatever the problem is in their life is to end their life.
right,
So there's a
right.
lot of hopelessness and despair
Yes,
in those negative thought processes for these individuals. And so I think that's also where, when we talk about holistic view of people, spiritual matters and spiritual needs go unaddressed for a lot of people.
yes,
Like I didn't research this, but I would guarantee if you looked at data from the 1950s, the number of these types of incidences is way less
right,
because when you're talking about, at least in America, it was one of the most religious periods of time in America. A lot more people claimed faith and were active in church communities and engaged
right,
in spiritual beliefs and practices. Um, Whereas I think nowadays you look at the data and it shows that a lot of people still claim to be religious and have beliefs, but what are those?
right, right.
And so there's more of a disconnect even in that nature where when we talk about having hope for the future, You watch the news a couple times a day, you're starting to feel pretty hopeless and despair, right?
Right. Well, I know, I'm constantly counseling clients, and it's something I've done myself, is to limit the screen time I have. I don't watch a lot of stuff, and I see headlines throughout the day. If it interests me, I'll read it. If not, I'm just deleting. And all I see is the headline. I It's a lot. It's a lot right now. It has been for the last however long. So yeah, moderation in that.
And again, yeah, not that those things are the problem or that those things can't be something that we enjoy, but again,
Right.
moderation. And so I think a lot
Yes.
of those things, we don't look at those things in moderation. And really, if we're honest, they control our time and our thoughts. And
Oh,
we're
yes.
constantly looking for those things to kind of help us deal with circumstances and
Mhm.
problems instead of actually addressing and understanding where the root of the problem comes from.
Right. I mean, and there's an addictive component
Oh yeah.
I mean, I would say that I'm addicted to my phone. I mean, if most of us were honest, we would have to acknowledge that. You know,
Yeah, and those
so,
companies spend millions of dollars
oh
to
yeah,
research and develop them that way, right? The same thing
that's
with the social
that's
media
right.
companies.
Yep.
They spend a lot of time and money researching that so people will continue to use their product. And
Yes.
it shows in what we see some of the data and how people are connecting to the world around them. And so I think that's part of that too. I think for to go back to your parent point about parents, I think sometimes kids express themselves with writing things down. And so, that to me is where can there be open lines of communication and how do you talk about those things with your own children? Um, where don't be afraid to have those conversations, right?
That's
Oftentimes they're looking for help. They want
yeah.
someone to notice something's going on. They're looking for someone to be aware of the warning signs, and what they're attempting to do is numb the pain that they feel.
Yes. They want their voice to matter. If I could sum up a lot of the conversations that I have with adult people, um, a lot, the majority of it is that hour in my office is their time to be heard when they don't feel like, in many cases, their voice is heard at work or their voice is heard in their marriage or in their community. And so they come in and that's their time to be heard, you know. So I remember being a kid and writing a letter to my parents. I was upset about something that they had done as far as discipline. And so I wrote a letter to them. And my mother and my father talked to me after I wrote the letter. Just they told me I should have been an attorney at that point. But that was my way of expressing. So to your point, the writing down might be helpful. Maybe a parent can say, if you don't feel comfortable telling me, why don't you write it down? Something to that effect. I love that. Now, for parents who might be listening to this who have lost, um, God forbid, a child to suicide, and they carry guilt, what do you say to those parents? What do you say to them?
Um, I think that's one of the hardest things because I think when we talk about guilt and shame eat away at us, right? It pierces the soul when you talk
Yes.
about things like guilt and shame and regret. Um, and so I think one of those things that we talk about in my practice and when I'm working with parents who have dealt with those kind of losses or those kind of experiences and not been able to deal with not feel like they did enough or feel like they were enough. Again, that becomes a core belief, right? And that doesn't just impact that relationship, that impacts other relationships that you keep having.
Absolutely.
And so I think sometimes we need to offer ourselves grace and kindness. So um, remembering those things and even taking a step back from how we're feeling about that. And if a friend came to us and was talking about this, what kind of advice or what kind of things would we say to them? Because I do believe sometimes there's not words to say in those moments.
No, I agree with you.
There's not always the right words. There's not
Mm-mm.
always a positive affirmation that's going to make
No.
someone not feel that way. But I think part of that, because what they're dealing with is actually they're dealing with they're if they're actually engaged in that process, they're working through grief
Yes.
and loss and pain and suffering.
No,
And I don't think we do that well nowadays either. We
no,
always
we
we
don't.
always want the easy way out or the alternative way out where we don't have to suffer in that pain, in that agony. And so oftentimes we think of that through other means and other ways. And for a lot of those people, that's something that they constantly it reminds them. And so I think one thing that really helps sometimes is how do you memorialize that in a positive way? How do you remember something about those individuals that you hold on to as a positive memory, as something that projects you moving forward? How do you get involved and help other people who might be in similar situations? Because for a lot of people, again, when we talk about depression, anxiety, trauma, they just lay around and they lose motivation to do anything. They don't have a desire to do things they used to enjoy. They don't want to. They're always feeling tired. And so the low hanging fruit in the counseling field for that is, okay, we're going to look at your diet, your exercise. We're going to look at your sleep patterns. We're going to look at how you spend your time. And we're going to seriously consider what kind of relationships do you have and evaluate those, because you need to be more involved in and kind of trying to get more involved in some way where you feel
Right.
like you're making an impact or changing things for yourself.
Right. I call those life-giving activities
Yeah.
versus life-sucking activities.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's those two, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so the other part too is, there are family members who have lost family members, their own siblings to suicide, and now they're parents, and there may be hypervigilance or overprotectiveness, overreaction. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah, hypervigilance is a really hard one because I think with those individuals, it's almost like the stress of that becomes so much that that's the only thing they can focus on.
Mhm.
And so again, there's more aspects of life and what else fills your cup in those moments too. And so what
Mhm.
do you do besides just focusing on the loss and people who are no longer here? I think some of that can really be you're trying to build for them those meaningful connections and how they are impacting people. And so oftentimes what can be really helpful when you talk about working with people through a process of like motivational interviewing, which is really
Mhm.
like change talk for people. I think one of the big factors there is, can you get them to realize that they've already been through, like they've lived through other difficult things, and how did they come
Right.
out of other difficult things? Because we all experience loss,
Hmm.
and how we experience loss oftentimes become how we work through the process of grief. For a lot of people, they don't work through that process.
Right.
They
They
talk
just want it
about
to
it
end. They
and
want
they
to
want
get
it
to
to
the other
end,
side.
and or they stay stuck in that grief and what they've lost, but they're not really working through the process of grieving those things. And I think you
Right.
really work through that process when you start to see that life continues, and how can you still memorialize and keep memories and um, have hope for living still.
Yes.
So, and so I think another factor, often you want to talk about the risk for those people too. Of, do they have some negative thoughts? Do they have access to certain things? Do they keep themselves safe? Do they engage in healthy choices and lifestyle decisions? Because again, for a lot of those people, when they start considering that, that's something they get stuck in.
Right.
Well, what was the reason? Why? Like that